Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The 20th CPC National Congress not only charts a new course for China, but also ensures a strong leadership that can carry out the new mission. How could China pull its own weight in a world grappling with simmering geopolitical tensions, rising inflation, a persistent COVID-19 pandemic, and a looming recession? For his thoughts on politics and history, I talked to Yuri Pines, who give us a historical perspective. Professor Yuri Pines, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You have been doing studies about China's ancient political culture and also the intellectual debate, the interconnection between the two. Tell me more about the logic you find.
I think that if I need to define very briefly Chinese traditional political culture, there are two words. One is diversity, the possibility of 100 schools of thought competing. It was very true before the imperial unification, and even after the imperial unification, you have considerable diversity, the ability to counter the major ideas. It is number one. And number two, unity or commonality of certain basic precepts. The commonality of idea that you need to have all under heaven unified, that you cannot perpetuate the situation in which the Chinese political thought came into existence, the situation of the warring states, of perpetual war. To end the war, you need unity. Unity means you need to have one legitimate ruler in all under heaven. And this is a very interesting issue because Chinese political thought developed this idea before China was actually unified. China is the only empire in the world which was envisioned before it came into existence. And this is one of the major interesting aspects of Chinese political thought.
How do you see, Professor Pines, during the spring and autumn and also the warring states when there were more than 100 school thoughts, how the debate was shaped, and eventually how politicians during the Qin dynasty, for example, which eventually united China, be able to work with this debate and came up with the kind of governance that eventually could contribute to the unity of China?
A very tough question. The debate was shaped because it was a freedom of occupation. You know, you tried to sell your ideas to one of the rulers. If the ruler did not buy your ideas, you go to another ruler. If he doesn't buy your ideas, you go to the third one, just like we move from one university to another university. If we don't like the president of our university, we are free to move. So it was very nice. It was very good.
This.
No, my president, I have good relations. It's okay. I hope he will not be angry. But, you know, this was very nice for intellectuals because you had a freedom of occupation and you had a freedom of expression.
How do you see people then, with a few hundred years of turmoil and chaos, be able to figure out a system at the time that would work and even eventually unified China, which has paved the way for a strong rejuvenation of China over the past centuries? And how do you see that example can be relevant today when there are very different systems around the world, very different cultures around the world, but we try to find out what can be the way out of chaos, out of turmoil, out of the vicious cycle of wars and conflicts?
You know, in the Warring States period, it was a very interesting situation that despite all these wars and despite all these fights, the intellectual group, the people who shaped Chinese culture, they were free to cross the borders and they thought about the solution which will be universal. They understood that you cannot have one state prosper if everybody around you collapses. The book, which was composed just on the eve of the imperial unification, Liu Shichunxiu, it says, when there is no peace under heaven, in all under heaven, there will be no single secure state. It is so true today. all these stupid ideas that I can close my borders and I will preserve my state intact, whereas all the world will collapse, it will never work because, pandemics crosses, war crosses, immigration crosses the borders, merchandise crosses the borders. You have pressure from everything. We are living in the interconnected world. So the problem, and now I come to the problem, that the solution which was offered in China 23 centuries ago, let us unify all under heaven, it worked because Chinese thinkers back then, they did not know too much of the entire world. They knew of East Asian subcontinent, which is huge by itself. And they very successfully unified this East Asian subcontinent, which we today call China, and created this great, great imperial state. Can we do it globally? I am afraid it is still impossible. And second, I think the world is too diverse and too ungovernable. And political cultures of component states of the world are too different. Whereas in China, there was some compatibility of different systems, we don't have it today. So can we find a nicer solution of great unity? What Mengzi said, stability is in unity. We have global challenges and we don't have now the unified body. Will it be possible to restore it? But I'm afraid that it will take time.
How do you understand the so-called orders of the world?
I think we are now facing something completely unprecedented. There were orders of the world which were actually orders of one region. For instance, the Westphalian system in Europe, it worked well in Europe. It is the foundation of the current international system of national sovereignty, but it worked originally only in Europe. It was not implied to work outside Europe. The Chinese world system, with China as the center and the tribute system, it worked very nicely in East Asia, a little bit outside East Asia, but it never was implied to work globally. Now we are in the much smaller world, much more interconnected, much more interpenetrated. Now what happens in China and the United States, states were very far separated by a huge ocean, but they influence each other immensely by 100 different ways. So we need something which will work not only in one region. We need something that will work globally. However, I still believe that it is better to first make some regional orders, to make something which will be viable, stable regions, Europe, Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, and then maybe Africa, of course, Latin America, and so forth, and then think about how you integrate these diverse regions, but when each of the regions which have their separate cultural traditions, separate history, separate understanding of what is good and what is bad, let each region first somehow not integrate, but at least attain some internal stability, and then we should think about new world order, because it must be the new world order, not the world order which is determined by Euro-American parts, but the global order in which everybody has something to say.
What is your interpretation of the current enthusiasm about cultural confidence? What do you see where the confidence can lie in, and what is it about?
I think it is a great question, and I think that it is the greatest issue of today's China. And only in the last 20, 30 years, China is coming to understanding that it has this absolutely huge, rich, deep repertoire of ideas and values, which was somehow forgotten and abandoned. And it is great for me that it is now rediscovered, and that now that Communist Party is aware of it. I think before that confidence can be restored, first of all, the traditional culture must be learned much deeper than it is learned today. It must be understood. It must be understood not as a set of slogans which are fitting for this or that situation, but in its immense richness, diversity, and pluralism, which can be used today, both to make China better.
Now, how do you see researchers, intellectuals today in China, particularly those doing historical research, are trying to find their roots And also, in your interactions with them, what have you learned?
You know, I was blessed to come to China 30 years ago and to study under one of the most brilliant scholars, who unfortunately already passed away, Professor Liu Zihua, who was the great scholar of traditional Chinese political culture. He was a modernizer. He was a May 4th generation person who wanted to make China modern, but he was also the person very much aware that before China can be modernized, it must understand, it must come to terms, it must realize what it had, what its cultural background. Today, very many people from very different angles, with some of them I agree, with some of them naturally I don't agree, they try to rediscover what we have in this great cultural legacy. Now, some people, of course, are making shortcuts and just find a slogan or something which fits nicely to the today's policies. I don't think it is interesting. The interesting is to think about something which fit to the policies of the future generation, which will shape the future of China and not just address the immediate demands. And there are people in China, and I hope there will be more people in China. And that is why actually I am coming to China to converse with my colleagues, with my students, and to help China rediscover its past.
Open-minded. Thank you so much, Yuri Pines.
Thank you.
As always, appreciate it. Yuri Pines, coming from Israel. That's all we have for today. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.